Welcome everyone, well arrived to the 28th of December. Even though it is shortly after Christmas, many people were still busy making history. Because you might be saying, I know that today, the 28th of December in 1895, Wilhelm Röntgen discovered a new type of radiation, which would eventually be known as X-rays. No. I know that today, 40 years prior, Iowa was admitted as the 29th state of the US. No. Actually, 10 years before that, in 1836, I know that this is when Spain recognized Mexican independence, and Mexico was founded as an independent standalone state. So we have plenty of busy people right at this time of the year, but for today, we're going to be busy another way. We're going to be looking, as we are approaching, or we are into right now, basically, the third reset of the season. We are going to be looking at our updated weekly check of the raid. The most obvious, of course, as always, is to check the popularity of the specs. So we are checking this one right here, the popularity of the specs in Mythic difficulty of last week. This is the results. Also, we can check the DPS popularity in the first week of the raid, just to see if there is any major changes from one week to the next. As we can see, of course, the numbers become much bigger in terms of popularity, but the placement of the specs have remained similar to the first week. So they have just increased, of course, but the placement of many of these specs has not changed by much. The only one worthy of note is that a few less Frost Death Knights are playing compared to before. Now there are more specs, more Death Knights trying to play as Unholy in the raid. For the most part, the popularity remains the same. So we can still look at the same things: Demo, Marksmanship, Arcane, Havoc, Balance, Fury, Outlaw, all being towards the top of the popularity when it comes to the raid. Then we can start looking at the tanks. This is going to be the one that we will drop the fastest, because generally speaking, once the tank meta is shaped in the raid, is going to stay like this for quite a long time. So as you can see, it's a large popularity of the most popular spec for Mythic Plus tanking, which is Protection Warrior, and then much less of the other specs, especially Protection Paladin and Guardian Druid. There is very few of those. Also, quite a few Brewmaster Monks. So it's generally a duo race. So generally, it's a pretty stable duo of Prot Warrior and Blood Death Knight when it comes to the combo of tanks you're gonna see in the raid, at the very least in Mythic difficulty. Then we have the Healers one. The Healers one is the more interesting, because as you can see here, there are some very tight numbers. No, not the tight numbers of Mistweaver and Discipline, but if you look at the top three, we have Holy Priest, Holy Paladin, and Preservation Evoker, and they are all between some 42 logs. They are all at 2,500, all very close to each other. And even the fourth one, actually, Restoration Druid, is back, but not that much. It's barely 10% behind those three specs. So this is, I have it on good authority, that this is the closest we have seen in many tiers, many expansions, the healer popularity being in the raid. Usually we are used to seeing one spec far ahead of the rest, or maybe even two specs far ahead of the rest, but seeing four of them quite close is, I would say, a first when it comes to the healer balance in the raid. So that is quite interesting to see the healers so even when it comes to the popularity in the raid. Then, of course, once we are done with the popularity, which hasn't changed too much from the week prior, the beginning of the raid, we can of course go and look at the cool stuff, at the performance of the specs. Now, we just finished with healers, so let's continue where we left off and start with healers, because there is something interesting to look at when it comes to healers. This was last week, so this was the first week of the raid. Now, if you remember, one of the hot fixes, or rather the only hot fix which changed the healers, was the buff to Restoration Druid. They were buffed in a couple of their raid talents, so mostly just talents used when you raid and not when you Mythic Plus, and then also they were buffed by 5% in all of their healing. So this was the first week of the raid, with Restoration Druid being somewhat in the middle, and this is now the second week of the raid, with Restoration Druid climbing and getting into a very clear second position compared to before. Now, What is worth pointing out is that both Discipline and Preservation Evoker are still at the bottom and the top of this ranking for healers. Preservation Evoker is quite easily at the top. It will of course still be the talk of the day about the buff to Restoration Druid, whether or not it was necessary, and also whether or not it was necessary to also buff them in Mythic Plus, as we will see likely tomorrow when we will be going over the situation in Mythic Plus. But so far, this is how things have been going in the raid. Then we go, of course, with the DPS, right? That's the cool part of the video. So this is the DPS we have seen so far in this new week, the second week of the raid. Now, the disclaimer, of course, is that for DPS, yes, it's true for healers as well, of course, but for DPS, we are starting to get tier sets. The 2-piece and the 4-piece is not that every spec in the first week of the raid was able to get 2 pieces, let alone 4 pieces. So, of course, the difference as we go on week by week of the DPS, more and more of them getting a tier set and therefore improving their performance is of course quite noticeable. No, the tier pieces are not nearly as OP as the tier sets from Sepulcher. So we're not talking about a 20+% damage buff you're gaining, it's more of a 5 to 6 to 7% at best. So it's not major, but it can still change the way you perform, some of which might even change your rotation, your priority of abilities, etc, etc. So it might import some changes to the rankings, to the meta, etc, etc. So this week we see that compared to last week, we have gotten still 2 of the rogue specs clear at the top, just like we had last week. The main difference is that Assassination grows even higher this week. Now it's even closer to meeting their rogue brothers at the top. We see a few other specs gravitating towards the top, like the return, again, surprisingly, of Retribution Paladin being towards the top, Havoc Demon Hunter being towards the top. What is a change compared to last week is Unholy Death Knight, because last week we noticed that Frost was somewhat in the middle, but Unholy was slacking behind significantly. Meanwhile, this week, we have way more logs, of course, of specs, and Unholy is doing much better compared to the start of the raid, the first week of the raid. That's quite significant. What isn't doing much better are the many casters, as we mentioned last week, the first week of the raid, many casters being at the bottom, because if you look at the bottom rankings, besides the odd Survival Hunter right there, we do have Destro, Affliction, Frost Mage, Fire Mage, Arcane Mage, Beast Mastery Hunter, and Shadow Priest. So it is a genocide of range DPS specs at the bottom, all of them. So there are very few survivors in terms of range DPS performing well. This is something that I'm afraid we will have to mention many times whenever we look at the DPS. Look at the top of the rankings of DPS and look at how many melee DPS there are compared to ranged. Because from my maths, I count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 melee DPS in the top 10. The only combo breaker is Marksmanship Hunter, which you can hardly call a range spec because they basically play like a melee. They barely cast anything, so the top of the performance right now is littered with melee specs, and very few range specs are performing well so far. So that is the thing to note once again in the second week of the raid. With this one being the performance, of course, there are a few things to point out when it comes to performance. As always, we go and point out the same thing we pointed out last week, the fact that bosses do and require different types of damage. So, for example, this is the Primal Council AoE log. Primal Council is a 4-target fight, so as we can see here, specs with very good, consistent 4-target cleave, 4-target damage profile are very high in their damage, so you can see Marksmanship, Balanced Druid, you have Subtlety Rogue, Enhancement Shaman, Outlaw Rogue, Feral, even Elemental Shaman and Shadow Priest, hitting multiple targets at the same time for extended periods of time are doing very well. Then you have Eranog, which is single target with periods of burst AoE damage. So not consistent 4 targets, but more like a burst of 6 targets being hit for a few seconds and then wait for 30 seconds and then AoE again. We can see that more bursty specs like Red Paladin, like Windwalker Monk, for example, Havoc Demon Hunter, go towards the top. And lastly, we have the initial, just the initial logs of Taros, which is a pure single target boss. There is no extra targets whatsoever, so this is just purely for single target, and we see one of the growths we saw in the overall rankings, Unholy Death Knight at the moment being one of the better specs. Enhancement is there. The other surprise, talking about one of the growing specs, is Arms. As you can see here, Arms is actually doing better than Fury Warrior by quite a bit. And if we go back in the DPS performance, one of the few things perhaps we should have mentioned is that Arms has passed Fury Warrior. But then again, as you can see, the difference is very, very tiny. So, you know, it's very volatile. It could change from one week to the next. But at the very least, on Taros, on single target, Arms is doing better than Fury at the moment. That's worth pointing out. What is also worth mentioning, since we're talking about raid and progression, is that logs are still in progress, so we're still bound to see many changes, because these are the logs of the Primal Council, the second boss of the raid. And as you can see, the average, if we make a raid of 20 specs like these, the average is in the 600 to 700 range of logs per spec. But then you see Taros, which is the third boss, and you can see that the average is in the 70. So there is almost 1/10 of the logs, and then it gets even worse on Sennart, the fourth boss, which is like 35 logs on average. So of course, those bosses are still quite volatile to try to see how they are performing, and you can only see at the moment in a large scale on the first couple of bosses. So there is plenty of room more to see changes when it comes to the performance of the specs. Together, of course, with the changes that the specs will gain from acquiring their tier pieces, their 2-piece and 4-piece set bonuses as well. Now, to close this raid overview, we are looking at my favorite thing to look at, which is the chances of the specs to die in the raid. That's right. So we looked, for example, as a comparison to this thing right here, which is Sepulcher. This was, I think, week 2 or week 3 of Sepulcher. Now, it's interesting because the first couple of weeks of Sepulcher saw guilds going through Vigilant Guardian, and then bosses like Skolex, bosses like Zymox, and bosses like Dosen. So, not particularly difficult, not particularly deadly. You had the rings to avoid on Dosen being quite tricky, and even the rings to dodge on Zymox being quite tricky, but they weren't particularly difficult. This raid, however, we have had our first raid block, as you can see by the kills right here. Taros is a significant drop in kill chance compared to the first 2 bosses. So, as you can see here, Arms was the deathest spec in the first couple of weeks of Sepulcher at 30%, but here, when you look at Vault of the Incarnates, after the first 7 or so specs, we immediately break the 30% barrier, and we go all the way up to 64% chances to die every pull of a boss, with Discipline being at the top. What is interesting to check in terms of the biggest swings and the old-timers returning to their natural positions, in terms of old-timers, Marksmanship, of course, is still at the top of being one of the deathest specs, Marksmanship being a notoriously squishy spec, just like Beast Mastery, to be honest, a little bit more actually than Beast Mastery. So Marksmanship is still dying quite a lot. We also see Discipline Priest, of course, being one of the deathest specs, no matter the raid, that is still there, and of course Balanced Druid. Balanced Druid is top 2 in Sepulcher, now is top 3 in Vault of the Incarnates. When it comes to the biggest swings of specs, you can see that the DK specs have suddenly turned way tankier. In Sepulcher, both Frost and Unholy, they were towards the top. Now, in the first couple of weeks on Vault of the Incarnates, they are all towards the bottom. So that's quite the significant change. You also have Resto Druid going all the way from being quite the tanky spec, difficult to kill, to moving in this raid in the top 7 of specs when it comes to death chance. So that's another pretty big swing. Also, there is another swing. Fury Warrior was the 3rd most likely to die spec, together with Arms, which was 1st. Now, in Vault, both Fury and Arms are towards the bottom half of chances to die, with Fury being particularly tanky, the 6th last spec in terms of death chance in pulling bosses in Mythic difficulty. So these are quite some significant swings compared to what we saw in the first couple of weeks of progression of Sepulcher, of the first ones. So it might be interesting to see as we progress deeper and deeper in bosses to see which specs are more prone to dying, especially when we start looking at each boss in particular. Maybe there will be some bosses being particularly deadly for range DPS, so we can start looking at which of the range are particularly messing up the encounter, or perhaps certain bosses being particularly deadly to melee specs, and we can start looking at which of the melee are messing up more on that encounter. But at the moment, this is what we see in the first couple of weeks of Vault of the Incarnates when it comes to death chance of specs. With this out of the way, we are done with our review and overview of the raid after 2 full weeks, as we are entering the 3rd week. We will eventually also go on an update on the kill and the amount of progression done by guilds, because there is quite some interesting things worth talking about at the start of this expansion, especially given how well the expansion has been received, given how many praises we have gotten for Dragonflight. It will be interesting to talk about why and how in this new expansion we are getting something like 1/2 or even 1/3 of the boss kills compared to previous expansions. Basically, way less raid participation compared to previous expansions. But that will be a discussion for another video. So for today, we are stopping here with our raid overview. Thanks, of course, as usual, as we start by thanking my Patreon supporters for contributing and supporting myself and this channel. You can, of course, still support in other ways that don't have you take cash from your favorite e-girl simping fund, like liking and commenting down below, as well as subscribing to the channel itself, are fine ways to show your support for free. You can also support by following me on Twitter to also check out, for example, whenever I go live on my stream. That will be the best way to do that. And of course, I am also streaming nowadays on Twitch. Generally, I start from 10 p.m. Central European times, 1 p.m. Pacific, and 4 p.m. Eastern US time zones. So with this all out of the way, thank you guys again for watching. See you guys soon. And in the meantime, I have to go out and shop for some groceries. I forgot where I live. We had 2 back-to-back holidays with all the shops closed. So I am literally right now out of food at all.